The 20th century was one of the bloodiest periods in human history, with 2 world wars, a Cold War between superpowers that threatened nuclear war, and hundreds of civil wars. This century saw the rise of new warfare technologies and strategies, which led to unimaginable death, especially conflicts that arose during the Cold War between the Soviets and the Americans, which saw every region of the world experience bloodshed, aside from Switzerland. But did it have to be this way? Could eternal peace be achieved following the First World War, truly making it the war to end all wars? What if the 2 superpowers which almost brought the world to nuclear annihilation were instead allies? What if the US and USSR united? The year was 1919, and the world seemed hopeful. With the Great War finally laid to rest, it seemed possible now that peace would be maintained. The only threat to this peace that still existed was the Russian Civil War, but following rapid Soviet successes, the Western powers decided to cut their losses, with the USSR taking power in Russia. Throughout the 1920s, there would be large-scale prosperity across much of the Western world, as nations from America to Japan see a time of economic boom. This would come to a grinding halt in 1929, however, after a crash in Wall Street caused the US economy to rapidly fall, which in turn led to the worldwide economy, which was heavily tied to the US, to also enter a recession. In our timeline, between 1929 and 1932, the US economy dropped by 30%, which when combined with the Dust Bowl led to widespread instability and discontent. This was not helped by the Republican government at the time, which preferred a hands-off approach to the economy. However, as the 1932 elections come around, our first change to the timeline will occur, as Al Smith, the runner-up to the Democratic primaries in our timeline, will decide to run as an independent candidate as a moderate to FDR. Though Smith does not win many states, he splits the Democratic vote, allowing Herbert Hoover to just barely win re-election, sparking riots across the country. Despite these, Herbert Hoover once again takes control over the country, continuing his laissez-faire policies as well as maintaining prohibition, only worsening the economic condition in the US while increasing crime rates. Over his presidency, though the economy's rate of decline decreases, it still continues to fall, by 1935 dropping to almost 50% of 1929 levels. During the 1934 Senate and House elections, the first Socialist senators and representatives are elected in US history, particularly from cities and industrial regions. The dissatisfaction with the government comes to a head in 1935, where Herbert Hoover is assassinated by a socialist while giving a speech, leaving his vice president, Charles Curtis, in charge of the country. However, just as in our timeline, Charles Curtis dies from a heart attack in February of 1936, leaving the Secretary of State, Henry L. Stimson, in charge of the country. The chaotic change of president, especially with Stimson not being elected by the people, combined with the deteriorating economic and social conditions, would cause massive revolts across the country to occur. Though the economy would recover slightly in 1936 under Stimson, the Republicans hoped that re-election under Alf Landon were hopeless. Despite in this timeline surviving his assassination attempt, Huey Long would still lose the Democratic nomination to FDR due to his more radical and populist stances. In response, he would decide to still run as an independent. However, this election would be different, as due to poor economic conditions, widespread crime, and dissatisfaction with laissez-faire policies, the Socialist Party, under Norman Thomas, would form a united front with the US Communist Party, forming the People's Alliance Party. In a monumental 4-way US election, the People's Alliance Party, despite not winning the popular vote, would end up barely winning the Electoral College through vote splitting, managing to break the 2-party status quo. In addition, the People's Alliance Party, along with several left-wing independents, gained further power in the Senate and House. Immediately following their inauguration, Norman Thomas and his vice president Earl Browder would immediately begin to implement radical reforms to the economy, nationalizing key industries, adopting a spending plan even more radical than the New Deal, lowering taxes overall while increasing taxes on the rich, and expanding social security programs. Through the first 2 years of his presidency, Thomas is able to make radical progress in restoring the US economy, gaining him and his party a massive boost in popularity. On top of this, the government would then push through a bill to repeal prohibition, once again allowing the consumption of alcohol. In foreign policy, the US re-establishes diplomatic connections with the USSR, restarting trade and beginning several intelligence exchange programs. Britain and France, now feeling encircled by communism, would attempt to divorce themselves from their connection with the US, not only beginning to invest even further into their own military rebuilding attempts, but also attempting to re-establish diplomatic relations with the Germans in aims of protecting themselves against communism. Due to this, the Western Allies do not respond to the German invasion of Poland in September of 1939, dividing Poland between themselves and the Soviets. Following the official signature of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and subsequent Soviet expansions into Eastern Europe, US-Soviet relations would decline markedly, though they would still maintain economic and research-sharing pacts. However, the Soviets' aggressive expansion does halt progress towards a defensive alliance between the two. Contrary to our timeline, the Germans remain at peace with the West, and thus are able to build up their own economy and military further in order to achieve their ultimate goal of destroying the Soviets. In the 1940 election, the People's Alliance Party would win a landslide victory due to their incredibly successful economic and social policies. On top of this, during both the 1938 midterms and the 1940 Senate and House elections, the People's Alliance Party would make even more gains, allowing them a slight majority in the Senate when including those that caucus with them. This greater control of the government would allow for them to enact even more extreme policies, including full nationalization of major industries, implementation of universal healthcare, stronger union power in the workplace, desegregation in the government and military, and the furtherance of black voting rights in the South. The US would also begin to take a more active foreign policy following its economic recovery, starting mutual economic development programs with the USSR. In Asia, due to the lack of a collapse of France, the Japanese do not seize Indochina and invade Southeast Asia like they did in our timeline. Instead, they would continue their focus on China for now, managing to make slight progress. It would be in 1941 when the Germans, following a signature of non-aggression with the French and British, begin their invasion of the Soviets. Though the Vice President Earl Browder would want to immediately support the USSR, both the Senate and the President would reject this plea, as the US public and Thomas would still be staunchly isolationist. Though the US would not join the war directly, there would begin massive increase in military shipments to the USSR, while beginning to rearm itself. Though the USSR may perform slightly better against the Germans due to their economic connections to the US and some military advisors helping in the war, the USSR would still significantly struggle against the Germans. However, by 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad would result in a stunning defeat for the Germans, halting their advance. In 1944, the incumbent President Norman Thomas would propose running for an unprecedented third term, which would cause significant backlash both within and from outside his party. Due to this contention, and out of a fear that he may lose the election, Thomas officially endorses Earl Browder to be the next president. Though he would not be as popular as Thomas, Browder, through association with him, would be able to win the 1944 election, though the People's Party would still not be able to gain a majority in the popular vote. Following his inauguration in 1945, Browder would push a bill through Congress to join the war against the Germans, making an impassioned cry about fighting a crusade against fascism. And so in March of 1945, the US would officially join the war on the side of the Soviets. Sorry to interrupt this video, but since I hit 5k subscribers, I'm contractually obligated by YouTube to do that annoying thing content creators do. Did you know that almost 90% of my viewers are unsubscribed? To keep up to date with all the crazy videos I have planned, please make sure to subscribe. Also, PS, I have a Discord, the link to which should be in the description of this video. Back to your regularly scheduled programming. The French and British, seeing the Germans begin to falter in the east, and now seeing the US join the side of the Soviets, now become fearful of the possibility that communism would spread all across Europe. In a shocking turn of events, they would officially join the war on the side of the Germans, in order to prevent the spread of communism. The US High Command, though shocked by this betrayal, would respond swiftly, moving their armies into key cities within Canada while seizing ports across the Atlantic. Within a month, the British would be forced to evacuate from Canada. The US would also launch an invasion of the French and British territories in the Caribbean and Guyana. In Europe, the British and French would send large amounts of resources and weapons to aid the Germans, prolonging their war with the Soviets, including utilizing their navy to assist in the siege of Leningrad, though the Soviets would be able to still make slight advances. In mid-1945, the Japanese, still struggling in their war against China, would sense the weak position that the European colonizers were in, and thus would sign a treaty of non-aggression with the Soviets and Americans, subsequently launching an invasion into the European colonies in Southeast Asia, making rapid successes due to the European focus being placed elsewhere. By November, the US blockades of Europe would begin to have severe consequences on the economies of the European states, which were only amplified due to communist uprisings being sparked in European African holdings, only straining their economies further. To make things worse, the Soviets were now making large-scale progress in pushing the Germans back, managing to entirely retake Ukraine and beginning a massive offensive which would encircle German troops in the Baltic by the beginning of 1946. However, European naval dominance would allow for most troops to be evacuated. By May, Soviet troops would march into Warsaw, while pushing down and toppling the government in Romania. Simultaneously, the US's funding of revolts in European colonies would manage to spark anti-colonial revolts in India, Algeria, and Egypt, which, though the latter two would be crushed quickly, the Indian revolt would seize large amounts of territory, as British troops are forced to retreat towards the south of the continent. In the fall of 1946, Soviet troops would march into Berlin, as the German government migrates its capital to Munich. However, despite the war's seeming loss for the Europeans, the French and British carry on their defenses, which many in the US and USSR believed would just be a waste of lives. And so, in November 1946, 4 planes would fly from Soviet-occupied Germany, and all of them would unleash their cargo onto 4 different cities. Overnight, Munich, Hamburg, Strasbourg, and York would disappear. Within 2 weeks, the British, French, and the remains of the German government would sign an unconditional surrender. In the peace treaty, communist governments across Europe were to be established, while the European colonies across Africa would gain independence under American Soviet-guided socialist regimes. In Asia, Japan would be allowed to annex Indochina, Malaya, and all of Indonesia, as well as the entirety of Papua New Guinea. Australia and New Zealand would be granted independence from the UK entirely, becoming republics. The British Raj would be released from British control under a left-leaning confederation of Indian states, while Sri Lanka would be annexed by the US as a naval base. In the Americas, the US would annex all European colonial holdings, including Canada. In addition, a worldwide organization composing of left-wing nations all across the world, known as the United Socialist Nations, would be formed, with the USSR and US as its key members. In the years immediately following the war, the US, under Browder, would transition to a full communist economy, completely eliminating private ownership of businesses. In addition, the electoral college system would be transformed into a system of unions across the country, which would send representatives, essentially eliminating the possibility for parties other than the People's Party to win the election. For the remainder of the 1940s, the US and USSR would build greater economic ties, to the extent where both nations would be heavily reliant on the other to function. In Europe and Africa, the US and USSR would instate socialist policies, while also significantly investing in the development of their economies to allow for a transition to communism. In the mid-1950s, the US and USSR would sign a treaty of mutual friendship, removing travel restrictions between the two countries and merging several military sectors between them. In 1960, both nations would begin an official move towards union, and by 1967, both countries would officially join into one, with a single government, bureaucracy, and military, known as the Union of Socialist States, or the USS. Under a similar model to the USS, Europe would begin to adapt a federal model similar to the EU, known as the Union of European Soviets. From here, the world moves forward, and I'm definitely sure that from here on out, nothing in the world could go possibly wrong, and that the world will be eternally peaceful until the end of time. But that's all for this episode, and I hope you enjoyed this totally serious video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to see more crazy videos. Comment down below any suggestions you have for future video topics. On screen now is a video which YouTube thinks you'll like. Stay crazy!